alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is the seventh lecture. Well, it's actually the eighth lecture because we had an introduction and we're going to be covering 10 mahlakat, the 10 things that destroy a person spiritually. And out of the 10, the seventh thing that destroys a person spiritually is hubb dunya, love of the world. In this day and age, some of our mashayikh say that post-Second World War, in the post-modernism world, they call it the POMO world. They said that the thing that destroys the people spiritually nowadays, and that has been the case for 70, 80 years, has been materialism, love of the world, which in the last 70 years things have just grown to a higher level. Imam Gazali rahmatullah alayhi says that hubb dunya ra'su kulli khatiyatin, that the love of dunya is the root of every single sin. This is not a hadith. It means that the essence of all sins is the love of dunya. But Imam Gazali rahmatullah alayhi also says further on that dunya isn't just love of wealth and status, because sometimes we think that dunya is love of wealth and love of status, but there's more than that. These are just the two branches of the dunya. And love of the world is defined as being attached to all the occupations of the world, all the things inside it, everything, being engrossed in it to a higher level. But he says, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah says there are three things inside the dunya that a person can be attached to, but you don't consider them to be dunya. In fact, they're things of the hereafter, although they're found in the dunya. Number one, religious knowledge, knowing Allah, marifat, and the third is pious actions. To love these three things in the dunya isn't part of loving dunya, but rather love of the hereafter. So the dunya itself, love of dunya, hubb dunya, is not just wealth and status, but it's everything. People, cars, anything. Anything that a person is engrossed in to such an extent that he's distracted from Allah Almighty. Allah Almighty says in the Quran Kareem, in Surah Al-Kahf, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَا مَعَ الْأَرْضِ زِينَةً لَهَا لِنَبْلُوَهُمْ أَيُّمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. That indeed we have created everything on the earth as an adornment for it, in order that we may test them which are the best of deeds. And everything that's been created on the earth in itself is a test, but we easily get distracted. And we look at our lives as human beings. Allah Almighty says, and our deen teaches us, that first of all we were in a state of non-existence. Then we came into existence. And then we were in the barzakh. Then we came into existence in the dunya. We pass away. We go to the barzakh. And then we rise on the day of judgment when hisab will take place. And then the hereafter, either Jannat or Jahannam. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, he then says that you only take what you need from the dunya because you're traveling. You don't overload your camel. And it reminds you of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. There's a play, I don't know if anyone reads it, but it's called As You Like It. Anyone who's got an English literature background will probably remember it. And in the play, As You Like It, Shakespeare, there's a poem that comes, one of the characters, I think his name's Jake, he comes out with a poem. They call the poem, who remembers it? All the world's a stage. All the world is a stage. And he compares the world to a stage. If you look inside the Quran, is it one of the verses of the Quran, Allah Almighty says that, tabaqan and tabaq, that from one stage to another a person passes through. His life is like a stage, one stage after another. Shakespeare, he captures this in this poem. And he says that our life is exactly like this. It's like and he says that the world is a stage. The world is a stage and life is like a play. And a single actor plays multiple roles on the stage. He says all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. My dad used to say, the game is the same, but the players keep changing. All the politics and the machinations and the, Tari Mary, everything. He used to say that, the game is the same, but the players keep playing. It's all the same. Politics is the same. But Shakespeare says all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and they have their entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts. We all play many parts. His acts being 7 ages. He calls it 7 ages. In our madhab, we probably say 10, but he calls it 7. At first, the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. Then the whining schoolboy with his satchel, second act. Yeah? And shining morning face, creeping like a snail, unwilling to go to school. And then he grows up, he gets in his youth, he becomes a lover, sighing like a furnace with a woeful ballad. He carries on, there's a few other things there. Full of strange oaths, and then a soldier he becomes. Full of strange oaths and bearded like the leopard. Jealous in honor, sudden and quick in a quarrel. So he grows a bit older, he becomes a little bit assertive. And then after that, then the justice, he retires from the army, he goes and he gets a bit older, he takes a nice little job and he becomes a judge. In fair round belly with good cap on, which means that, he becomes a little bit fat. With good cap on, lined, yani chicken, cap on is chicken. So he's eating well, he becomes a little bit in his middle age, in his 40s. And then he says, with eyes severe and beard of formal cut, full of wise sayings and modern instances, and so he plays his part. And then the 6th age shifts into lean and slippered pantaloon. Right? He becomes a bit old, he retires. His trousers become a bit loose for him. Why? Because his muscle mass goes less. Yeah? And then with spectacles on nose and pouch on side, his youthful trousers well saved, a world too wide. His clothes don't fit him anymore because he's getting old, very thin. And then he says, slowly, last scene of all, that ends his strange, eventful history, is a second childishness. When he becomes old, he goes back to becoming a little child. And then after that, it's mere oblivion, death. Sans teeth, sans eyes, without teeth, without eyes, without taste, and without everything else. That's what he says. And he says that life is like the 7 stages, and the person passes through, and in the end is death. We say there's another 3 things: life in the hereafter, the barzakh, the grave, resurrection, and either Jannah or Jahannam. So that's what life actually is. And Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi in this section, he says dunya is just a place that person travels through. He needs to catch something, he needs to earn something in order to benefit him in the hereafter. And he says that the man has connection to 5 things in the dunya. He has connection to the earth for harvesting, for living, house, etc. Number 2, the vegetation for food or medicine, flowers to enjoy. The 3rd is minerals for jewelry, ornaments, utensils. The 4th is animals and livestock for riding and hunting. And the 5th is people for marriage purposes, as servants, etc. All of this has been mentioned in the Quran al-Kareem. Allah Almighty says, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ من النساء والبنين والقناطير المقنطرة من الذهب والفضة والخيل المسومة والأنعام والحرث ذلك متاع الحياة الدنيا والله عنده حسن المآب. The beautified for people is the love of that which they desire, women and sons, heaps of gold and silver, fine branded horses and cattle and land. That is the enjoyment of the worldly life, but you shouldn't attach yourself to it. And that's where Hawa nafs comes into it. Don't attach yourself to these things. Utilize them as much as you need. Focus on the hereafter. Allah says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ, the person who fears the position of his Lord. وَأَنْحَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ, and he forbids the nafs from attaching itself too much to the dunya. فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَىٰ, for indeed Jannah shall be his abode. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, he cites his verses and he says that indulgence in the dunya destroys a person. And the person begins to think that the dunya is a place of play and amusement. But know that life of this world is only play and amusement, pomp and mutual boasting. Mentions the Quran and Hadith in the Quran. اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في الأموال والأولاد. He carries on. Allah says that know that the life of this world is only play and amusement, pomp and mutual boasting amongst you, rivalry in respect of wealth and children. And then he gives an example of this, like vegetation after rain. It rains here all the time in England, so everything stays green. But recently, last few weeks, it's been raining in Makkah. It's been raining in Medina. Everything's become green. Everything becomes green very quickly. But then once it stops raining and it dries up, then what happens? You see it turning yellow, Allah says. Then it becomes straw. And this is what dunya actually is. That everything's green, you're at the prime of your youth. But then slowly, as the years pass by, things become yellow. You become a bit loose. It becomes a bit cranky for you to get up. It becomes a bit difficult. It becomes like straw. But in the hereafter, there is a severe torment for the disbelievers. And there is forgiveness from Allah and good pleasure for the believers. And whereas the life of this world is only a deceiving enjoyment. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions that being involved in the world leads and breeds many internal destructive spiritual illnesses. Pride, jealousy, all the things. He says that it all goes back to dunya. Then he says that in order to free oneself from all of these spiritual illnesses, in order to acquire the dunya, just a little bit, as he progresses, he becomes entrapped in trade, work, farming, business, and all of these activities that are temporary. He becomes a 24/7 workaholic. He's chasing everything. But he forgets the real purpose of him being in dunya. And the real purpose of him being in dunya is the hereafter. He needs to earn to live, but at the same time, he makes it his purpose, his maqsad. Whereas the purpose should be the hereafter. His zahir and his batin both become dunya. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah, then he says that the purpose of the dunya is for the travelers on the way to the hereafter to earn and easily complete their journey. But the fools have forgotten their original purpose and confined themselves to this dunya. And then he gives an interesting example for this. He says that a person goes for Hajj. He reaches the wilderness. He becomes preoccupied with feeding his animal. Like at a service station. You just stop there for a few minutes, do what you need to do, and you go. But if you stay at the service station, and in those days, he focuses on his animal in order to fatten it. But the caravan that he's traveling with moves on, and it carries on, leaving him behind. He's left alone. Then what happens? He misses the Hajj. And if he's not careful, he might also be attacked by animals. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says the dunya is exactly like this. The person focuses on the dunya and he remains in the dunya. But then he forgets about the hereafter, and then when the time is too late, he has nothing to go back in the hereafter with. He also provides another example inside this section. He says that the dunya is like, the people in the dunya are like a people on a ship. He arrives at a beautiful island. The organizers of the trip tells them, you're allowed to disembark, get what you need, and quickly come back, because this place is very beautiful, but it's also very dangerous. We need to continue with our journey. But the people, Imam Ghazali says that the people are divided into 4 categories. Some complete their bare essentials and they return. They don't waste any time. They come back to the ship. They find the choicest of places, the best place, the best seat, and they sit down there. They've got a nice view. They've got a breeze coming in. They sit down. And they get the best food. Once they come back, they position in a way that they're having all the services on the ship properly. That's the first group. The second group, they go out into the island, but they take their time a little bit. They become busy in enjoying the scenery, the fresh air, listening to the birds, he says. But they return. On their return, they notice that the best seats have gone, but still they manage to find a small place somewhere. They sit a bit tight, but they sit down. Maybe it's slightly uncomfortable, but not so uncomfortable. And they sit down. So that's the second group. The third group, they fall in love with the island. They just can't leave it behind. They began collecting, buying things duty-free. They buy everything, whatever they can. They return back to the ship a bit late. By the time they return, they're stuck. Why? Because all the baggage space is gone. The best seats have gone. They find a small, narrow space. They sit down there. But there's nowhere to put their luggage, so they put the luggage on their heads. So they're in a lot of discomfort. But they make the journey and they carry on. This is the third group. And then the fourth group, they're completely enthralled by the island. They love it, absolutely. They have a good time. They enjoy it fully. They forget the boat. When they remember about the boat and they come back to the shore, to the port, they see that the boat's moving on. It's left them behind. It's got to carry on. And they stay there. And they stay there and they've got nowhere else to go. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that these people become helpless. And eventually they're attacked by wild animals, whatever, etc. And he says this is the nature of our connection to the dunya. Which category do we fall under? Let us work it out ourselves. Are we in the first category, the second, the third, or the fourth? Thereafter, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh, he says that the dunya and the hereafter are two polar opposites. As Shaykh al-Hadith Manzakir rahmatullah alayh, Fazail Sadaqat, and Fazail Sadaqat part 2 is all about the dunya. Everything about the dunya, its negative traits is mentioned by Hazrat Shaykh in Fazail Sadaqat. As Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi says that in Fazail Sadaqat, that the dunya and the akhirat are like two wives. They're like two wives married to one husband. If you please one, you displease the other. If you please the other, you displease the one. You can't, they're polar opposites, negative and positive. They just cannot get on with each other. Or if one's happy with the husband, the other one's unhappy. He said dunya and akhirat is like this. Imam Ghazali writes that the person who's recognized his nafs and he has marifat of Allah Almighty and he understands the adornment of the dunya and he knows the hereafter, then through the nur and insight of himself from inside, he'll understand what the dunya actually is. And he'll come to the conclusion that sa'ada, happiness, true happiness in the hereafter is for the person who has marifat of Allah Almighty. And he loves Allah Almighty. But Imam Ghazali then says that in order to get true happiness in the hereafter, two things are necessary: love of Allah and marifat of Allah. But the love of Allah can only come through perpetual zikr, dawami zikr. And marifat can only come through meditation and asking Allah Almighty. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he says that both these things will only come to the person who turns away from the dunya and he focuses on the hereafter. And the only way to do that is by turning away from the dunya. And he has to be content with what little he has. That's sufficient for his needs, and he's then focusing on the hereafter. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says that something like 1/3 of the Quran is full of verses condemning the dunya and the people of the dunya. And then he mentions a number of hadith. And this is what he says. He says, قال صلى الله عليه وسلم الدنيا ملعونة, that the dunya is cursed. ملعون ما فيها, cursed is that which is inside it, except for the dhikr of Allah Almighty. And except for the dhikr of Allah Almighty. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in another hadith, Ya ajaba, how surprising, kull al-ajabi, completely surprising, lil musaddiq bidar al-khulud, for the one who verifies and he's truthful and he testifies of the dar al-khulud, of the hereafter, which is perpetual, it's going to remain forever. وَهُوَ يَسْعَى لِدَارِ الْغُرُورِ, but the person at the same time, he's making effort for the abode that is delusional, which is the dunya. It's only going to stay with us for a little while. Yani ajaban, how surprising, complete surprising. And we say and we do tasdeeq and we believe that the Dar al-Khulud is there, that the house of the permanent house, the permanent abode, which is the hereafter, is there. But our effort and energy is towards the house, the abode, which is delusional, which is only going to remain for a little while. Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in another hadith, "Ad-dunya hilwatun khadiratun," that the dunya is pleasant and green, something that you like. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ مُسْتَخْلِفَكُمْ فِيهَا, and Allah Almighty creates one generation after another inside the dunya. Why? فَنَاظِرٌ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ, to see how you do. How do you carry out your actions? Any one generation comes, another goes. 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, does anybody remember anybody else? People who passed away 10 years ago, do you remember? You might remember them, but you forget them slowly. وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ, Nabi Karim says in another hadith, إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ لَمْ يَخْلُقْ خَلْقًا أَبْغَضَ إِلَيْهِ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, that Allah Almighty has not created anything that's more disliked to Him than the dunya. وَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يَنْظُرْ إِلَيْهَا مُنْذُ خَلَقَهَا, and indeed Allah Almighty has not looked at the world since He created it. And this is how despicable the dunya is in the eyes of Allah Almighty. In another hadith, Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man asbaha wa dunya akbaru hammihi," that a person who performs his morning, who gets up in the morning, and the dunya is his main focus, his main worry, the greatest worry of his. فَلَيْسَ مِنَ اللَّهِ فِي شَيْءٍ, there's no connection for him to Allah Almighty. وَأَلْزَمَ اللَّهُ قَلْبَهُ أَرْبَعَ خِصَالٍ, Allah Almighty then gives four different attributes to his heart. He attaches 4 different attributes to his heart. Hamman la yanqati'u anhu abadan, yani a worry that never ends, it's ceaseless. He's completely engrossed in the world, He has some sort of worry that always remains with him completely all the time. وَشُغْلًا لَا يَتَفَرَّغُ عَنْهُ أَبَدًا. And he becomes so busy, so busy, so busy that he never becomes free from it in any way whatsoever. وَفَقْرًا لَا يَبْلُغُ غِنَاهُ أَبَدًا. And a type of poverty that never reaches wealthiness ever. Any person might have wealth, but he still thinks he needs to do more. And these are the three things. And the first one, amadan, and a hope and a desire, la yablugu muntahahu abadan, that never reaches its end ever. And Allah Almighty, Nabi Karim says in this hadith, which is mentioned by Dailami, that when a person makes dunya his greatest worry, four things happen to him. Number one, he becomes worried always, perpetual. Number two, he becomes so busy he has no time for anything else. He becomes so poor that wealth never really reaches him. Then he might be wealthy, but he still thinks he's poor. He still needs to do more. And he has hopes, lengthened hopes, that he never comes to the end. Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu says, Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Ya Abu Hurairah, Ya Abu Hurairah, O Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala anhu, shall I show you the dunya in its entirety? He said, yes. فَأَخَذَ بِيَدِي إِلَى مَزْبَلَتِي. He took him by the hand to a mazbala, to a rubbish heap. فِيهَا رُؤُوسُ أُنَاسٍ, in which was the heads of people, any bones, skulls. وَعَزِرَاتٌ, refuse. وَخَرْقٌ, rags. عِظَامٌ, bones. And he said, O Abu Hurairah, هَذِي رُؤُوسْ كَانَ تَحْرِسُ كَحِرْسِكُمْ, that these heads used to be haris. They used to really want something. They were eager to get things just the way you are eager. وَتَعْمَلُ كَأَمَلِكُمْ, they had hopes just like you had hopes. ثُمَّ هِيَ الْيَوْمِ عِظَامٌ بِلَا جَلْدٍ, and today they are just bones without skin. ثُمَّ هِيَ صَائِرَةٌ رِمَانٍ, and afterwards they'll become sand and dust. وَهَذِي الْعَذِرَاتِ, and all this refuse and rubbish. أَلْوَانُ أَطْعِمَةٍ, is a different types of food that they ate, that they earned. مِنْ حَيْثُ اكْتَسَبُوهَا, they earned it from wherever they earned it. ثُمَّ قَذَفُوهَا, then it threw it up from their stomachs. فَأَصْبَحَتْ وَالنَّاسُ يَتَحَامُونَهَا, and now it's become such that people avoid this area. وَهَذِي الْخَرْقُ الْبَالِيَةِ, and these rags was their clothes and their personal items. فَأَصْبَحَتْ وَالرِّيَاحُ تَصْفِكُهَا, and now it's become such that the wind blows it around. وَهَذِي الْعِظَامُ, and these bones are the bones of their animals. الَّتِي كَانُوا يَنْتَجِعُونَ إِلَيْهَا أَطْرَافَ الْبَيْضِ, on which they used to travel from here and there across the country. فَمَنْ كَانَ بَاكٍ عَلَى الدُّنْيَا فَلْيَبْكِ, and then Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said to him that whoever wants to cry on the dunya, then let him cry. And this was the reality of the dunya, as mentioned by Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In another hadith, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, لَيَجِيءَنَّ أَقْوَامٌ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَأَعْمَالٌ كَجِبَالِ تِحَامَةٍ. He says, definitely, groups of people shall come on the day of judgment, and their actions shall be like, then their amal will be such that they be as great as the mountains of Tihama, which is in the Hijaz. But they shall be cast into the fire. The companion said, O Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, musallun, did they pray salah? He said, yes, they prayed and they fasted. And they used to spend a bit of time in the night offering some ibadat and some tahajjud. فَإِذَا عَرَضَ لَهُمْ شَيْءٌ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَثَبُوا عَلَيْهِ. But however, when something from the dunya came to them, they jump at it. They run after the dunya. Isa alayhi salam says, لا يستقيم حب الدنيا والآخرة في قلب مؤمن. He says it cannot be correct that the love of dunya and the love of the akhirat can be inside the heart of a person. Both of these things can't come together. كما لا يستقيم الماء والنار في إناء واحد. In the way that fire and water can come inside a pot itself, in a single pot. You can't gather them together. In the same way, dunya and akhirat, the love of these two things can't come into the heart of a person at once. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, احذروا dunya, be careful about the dunya. فإنها أسحر, for indeed it's more magical, or it's more, there's more sorcery in it than the sorcery of Harut and Marut, the two angels as mentioned in the Quran. Hazrat Isa alayhi salam said, Ya ma'ashal hawariyin, or disciples, he says, be happy with just a bit of dunya, ma'a salamati din, whilst your religion is protected. Kama radiya ahlu dunya bidani din ma'a salamati dunya, in the way that the people of the dunya are happy with just a little bit of deen whilst the dunya is protected. And you protect your deen and be happy with a bit of dunya. What do we see nowadays? We see people, they work, but then they don't pray Jummah. or they miss the salah. Why? Because, well, the work doesn't allow me to go for Jummah. Or the work doesn't allow me to fast in Ramadan because of the situation. I do qadha afterwards. You do get people like this. They trade their deen in exchange for dunya. That shouldn't be the case. The dunya is just a means to help us, to assist us in deen, to help us, assist us in deen, to move forward. وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام أيضا للحواريين, Nabi Isa alayhi salam also said to the disciples, لا أكل خبز الشعير بالملح الجريش, that eating barley bread with unrefined salt and wearing coarse clothing, or no more ala mazar, and just sleeping on a rubbish heap, is with the afiyat, kathirun ma'a afiyat dunya wal akhirah, is great with afiyat in dunya and hereafter. And to have afiyat and to be well saved and to be protected in terms of dunya and akhirat, and just to have a few little personal items and to eat simple food, wear close clothing, and also to sleep very simply is enough for a person. And Isa alayhi salam, he says regarding him, as the Shaykh mentions this inside his Fadail Sadaqat, that Hazrat Isa alayhi salam kushifa bid dunya, that the dunya appeared to him in a vision. Fara'aha fi surati ajuzin, he saw it in the form of a very old lady who was dressed beautifully. She was dressed extremely beautiful. And she also had lots of ornaments, but she's a very old lady. Isa alayhi salam said to her, and in the dunya, kam nakahti, how many people have you married? فقالت inni la uhsihum, I cannot count them. فقال, he then said, did they divorce you or did they die? And did you separate from them through divorce or did you separate with them from death? She said, no, bal qataltu kullahum, I killed all of them. And the love of dunya was such that she killed, the dunya killed them completely. فقال عيسى عليه السلام بؤسا لأزواجك الباقين كيف لا يعتبرون بأزواجك الماضين. He says, how terrible for those husbands of yours that remain behind. لا يعتبرون, they don't take any lesson, they don't take any heed with your husbands that have already passed. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, then he says, أن من ظن أنه يلابس الدنيا ببدنه ويخلو عنه بقلبه فهو مغرور. وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مثل صاحب الدنيا كمثل ماشي في الماء. And then he concludes and he says that he says that Nabi Karim sallallahu says in a hadith that the example of the person of dunya is like the person walking on water, in a stream or a puddle. هل يستطيع الذي يمشي في الماء? Is it possible for the person who's walking water Allah tabattala qadamahu, that his feet do not become wet? And the person of dunya is just like that. You're in the dunya, your feet are going to get wet. As Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu wrote to Salman Farsi radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said that mathalu dunya ka mathal hayya. He said that the example of dunya is like a snake. Yalinu massaha, touching it is very soft, but its venom and its poison will kill a person. Fa'arid amma yu'jibuka minha, turn away from that which attracts you from the dunya. لِكِلَّةِ مَا يُصْحِبُكَ مِنْهَا, because it's only going to remain with you for a very short while. And don't worry about the dunya, he says, because it's going to separate. And then he says, be apt your happiness when you are most weary of it. For indeed, every time its owner finds solace and happiness in it, some detestable thing takes it from him. Isa alayhi salam says in another saying, مَثَلُ طَالِبِ الدُّنْيَا كَمَثَلِ الشَّارِبِ الْمَاءِ الْبَحْرِ, that the seeker of the dunya is like the person who drinks from the ocean. Kullama izdada shurban, as soon as he drinks more, the more he drinks, izdada atshan hatta yaktaluhu, then his thirst increases. And lastly, Imam Ghazali says, and he concludes by saying that, know that whoever finds comfort in the world while certain he will depart is at the pinnacle of foolishness. And he provides an example of a homeowner. He says that there's a homeowner, he has a house, beautiful house, and he invites a load of guests to his house, and he has a golden dish or golden tray there, and he's got bakhur burning on it, incense burning on it, and everyone that comes is welcome to come and take it and smell the fragrance. Some simpleton comes in, he doesn't understand the way the house is and where the norms, that he's not giving it to you to take with you, he's giving it to enjoy the fragrance. So the guy sits there and he starts enjoying it. After a little while, the owner comes back to him and says to him, give me the bakhur back. And he becomes angry. He becomes angry. Why? Because he thinks he's given it to him. But it's not really his, it's the owner's. And he wants to keep it. Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, this is our situation. Our situation is exactly like this. That the dunya is not ours, it's somebody else's, it's Allah Almighty's. It's for our inheritors. But we become so attached to it that when it's taken away from us, we become angry. And then he says, فَكَذَلِكَ سُنَّةُ اللَّهِ فِي الدُّنْيَا. And this is the way of Allah in the dunya. فَإِنَّا دَارُ ضِيَافَ عَلَى الْمُشْتَازِينَ لَا عَلَى الْمُقِيمِينَ. Indeed, it's the abode of for guests. It's a place where a person is hosted. But the people who are being hosted are those that pass by, not those who are going to remain forever. And the people that pass by, let them take some provisions from it with which they can benefit themselves. And it's like benefiting from a hotel. You leave it behind and then you carry on and you leave it for the people that are coming after that. Our example is exactly this. And the example of the dunya is exactly this. وَمَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ فِيهَا. And everything that's created inside, it's like a hotel. Temporary moment. You enjoy the moment, you take what you need, you carry on, you don't attach yourself to it. وَآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Inshallah, may Allah Almighty give us the tawfiq to act upon all of this and to detach ourselves from the dunya and to understand it. And one of the books that our mashayikh often mention, which all of this is mentioned inside there with a lot more detail, and you can read it at leisure, is Fazail al-Sadaqat Part 2. The Shaykh al-Hadith Manzakir Rahmatullah Alayh, in Fazail al-Sadaqat, especially Part 2, he's gone into all of this with a lot of detail with the dunya, inshallah, about the dunya and its temporary nature. Allah give us the tawfiq to understand that and to act upon that. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Inshallah, we'll carry on next week.